Thanks everyone for joining the Data Privacy and Governance session on is the current legal and regulatory framework sufficient to answer the next big ethical questions. We have a fab panel put together to pep you up after lunch, and if I'm just going to let them introduce themselves for about 2 minutes and to give a headline view on whether they think the current regulatory framework does work for the emerging tech and the ethical issues that will come about from it. By way of introduction, my name's Emma Wright. I'm the director at the Institute of AI, which is a not-for-profit cross-parliamentary network with 30 countries looking at collaborating on AI use cases and regulation. Anyway, Ricardo, if you'd like to.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. Ricardo Masucci, the Global Director of Privacy Policy at Intel. Since I'm supposed to give a short keynote, I won't bother you with my answer on... no, we'll do the round. That's all. Very nice to meet you all.
Hi everyone, my name is Ivana Bartoletti. I'm the head of privacy and data protection at a consultancy firm called JumpServe, and I am the co-founder of an organization called Women Leading Artificial Intelligence, which is an international group of women across working on privacy and ethics around artificial intelligence. One second view around all this is that a lot of this will have to be seen. That's what I think. I think it would be really good to have a fitness test to see and understand in detail current legislation around privacy, about discrimination, around consumer legislation, competition, or how much all this is there and is able to protect and safeguard individuals around individual harms and also group harms, not just individual, and also representation harms. But I do think, what I would really like to see is a sort of fitness test and say, where are we? What is the current legislation doing, not just in terms of privacy, but all across the sectors?
Okay. Right. Oh, I was expecting to have to talk for a few seconds before the microphone worked. So my name is Simon MacDougall. Full title is Executive Director, Technology and Innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office, which I bore myself by saying because it's so long. In terms of initial thoughts on this, a couple of thoughts. Firstly, the GDPR is young. And those of us who went through it probably felt quite old by the time it came in, but it is still young, and there's a whole world of it which is untested in different ways. And I think one of the things we'll explore in this discussion, which I'm really interested in, is where there are limitations in the legal framework, or, if we're being blunt and frank with ourselves, the limitations are more around either interpretation or what has been enforced upon yet. And I'm saying this as the regulator on the panel, because there's, in the real world, there's many resource limitations on what anybody can do, and a question as to what can be worked on at any one point in time. So those are I think there's a very kind of key points as to what we actually think needs to change. Is it more resource to a regulator, maybe us, maybe others? Is it more? Is it us doing something differently, or is it that there's new rules or regulations that need to be introduced? Those are different things. If we get into detail, I think there are lots of little points already where the GDPR is showing strain. I think in many cases, and I will probably come out in defense of the GDPR points along this, around fairness and accountability and transparency, there's lots there. If you get into detail, you have questions around how does GDPR work with blockchain? How does it work with rights to explanation and whether they work with AI? How does it work with balancing societal harms against personal harms? There's lots of little points, I think, well, not little points, but detailed points, which are really critical here as well. So that's my two penneth.
I'm Jenny Tenzin. I'm CEO at the Open Data Institute, which is a not-for-profit with a mission to work with companies and governments to build a open, trustworthy data ecosystem. I suppose three things that I would highlight. First is that we're at a digital ethics summit, and obviously the context of digital ethics is much, much broader than just data protection, and we shouldn't, so GDPR only bites off a portion of what we should be considering when we're talking about ethics, and in particular, only the personal data portion of that when there are ethical implications from the use of all sorts of non-personal data as well. Second point, which partially came up in Elizabeth Denham's address earlier as well, is about the kind of role and responsibilities of the individual versus the role of and responsibilities of companies versus the role and responsibility of regulators and the state. And at the moment then GDPR puts quite a lot of emphasis, I would argue, on the role of the individual exercising rights, and we don't always have the capability or time, or at least those that have capability and time are unevenly distributed in the population, and that has some implications. So to what extent should we be pushing more of responsibility onto companies and other organisations that handle data for their responsibilities around what they do, and in particular for some of these pieces around group privacy or where data affects multiple people or societal harms, that comes into focus. And third point I would make is around just when you get into GDPR, there's some natural fuzziness around some of the pieces. Explainability of AI, really excellent work coming out of ICO around how to dig into the detail of that. I think we still need to do some more work, for example, on how to claim legitimate interest. What does that actually mean? How can you prove your legitimacy? So there's still details to work out as we go through like maturing of GDPR. We'll come back, I hope.
Thank you. My name is Martin Cecily. I'm Managing Director at Luminate, which is a philanthropic organisation, part of the Media Group. I think we're going to have, not sure what Natasha will say, but I think we're going to have violent agreement on the panel, at least so far. I think the only thing I'd add is, I think that data protection as an overall paradigm only takes us so far, as others have said, but I think it's really worth emphasizing this notion of the individualization of the problem that data protection begets. We have an overall framework that really dates back to the 70s and their OECD consensus on privacy when we talk about data protection, and that was a time where people had a sort of more binary or bilateral relationship to data. Me and my credit card company, I want my data to be safeguarded, to be used in this or that way, which is just no longer possible at all. And I think that the implication, as Jenny was saying, that the decision-making just can no longer be as delegated as it is to the individual, is that we will need to make choices when it comes to the societal impact of data and sort of public interest tests for data. So I think just 4 points I would make on that. One of them is, I think we need to make a lot more investment and effort when it comes to harnessing collective action when it comes to data. I think data trusts are a very good way forward. There's a lot of talk about them. There's not enough action from our perspective. The second one is we really need to work harder to open up systems to enable investigative journalists and others to externally test automated decision-making systems. Again, we talk about it a lot, but I haven't seen that much legislation, saying that whenever there's an automated decision-making system, it should be flagged, its purpose should be flagged, etc. The third piece is on inferences. I think there is a lot of interesting work. We've been funding some work at the Oxford Internet Institute, Sandra Vactor and others' work around a reasonability test for inferences, which we may want to talk about, and whether that falls under GDPR or not. But the fourth one, I think, is the least discussed, is around optimization systems. I think that we need to much more directly think about regulating optimization and what can and can't be and what shouldn't be optimized for. And that will be a difficult conversation, and people will want to leave it to the private sector or to individuals to decide, but I think in some cases there's a very clear role for the state, and I'm happy to talk about it later if that helps.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Natasha McCarthy. I'm Head of Policy at the Royal Society, which is the UK's National Academy for Sciences, and I lead our work on data and digital technology policy. So I've got kind of two questions that I think would be important for the discussion. One, I guess, is a question for professional ethicists. One is a question of professional ethics. The first one relates to some work that we did with the British Academy of Humanities and Social Sciences back in 2017, the year this conference started, looking at a kind of governance framework for data for the 21st century, where we called for kind of stewardship of the whole data governance landscape. And one of the things we said in that work was that there are some fundamental concepts under strain. So the concepts that underpin governance like GDPR and frame the context in which it applies are under strain because of the way that we use digital technology. One of those was ownership of data, and there's been some really interesting conversations about how we rethink our relationship with data in relation to rights of ownership. But the concept of privacy itself is under strain because of the ways that we collect data passively without people's knowledge, and in the ways that we can share data in lots of different ways. So I think one of the points is that there's always a broader question, and I guess this is part of what everybody said, and this is what we're doing right here, about how do we understand the way that our expectations of privacy are changing in relation to technology and how they might be bringing in new privacy risks and harms. So I guess one question is how do we make space for that much bigger, broader question? The second question is around work on things like privacy-enhancing technologies. So what are the technical solutions for enabling us to use data whilst protecting privacy of individuals and organizations? And we've been interested in this space. We're interested in technologies that enable us to analyze data whilst it's encrypted, that enable us to analyze data that's held in lots of different places to stop us having to bring it all together, or ways of kind of handling data so that we can minimize privacy risks. And my question around that technology is, what are the professional ethics questions about when we should be using those technologies, when it's our responsibility to use those in handling data? But also, when should we be careful about the kind of reality of what those technologies can actually deliver? So I think there's some really interesting questions about the possibilities and limitations of the technology that can underpin this governance.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. Ricardo is now going to give a brief presentation as a provocateur.
Sure, and I have to take this, and I have to apologize because I will probably a bit clumsy multitasking with two things in my hands and speaking. I also think that it's quite difficult being thought-provoking after lunch when everybody is sleeping, so I apologize in advance if I won't achieve that. I wanted to quickly talk about some things with you. I'm very happy you won't be able to see all the titles of my slides, so there are three ideas that I would like to share with you this afternoon. The first one is linked to access to data. The second one is about privacy-preserving machine learning and all those techniques that are used to enhance privacy. And the third point are some reflections regarding future directions for technology and policy approaches. I want to start with access to data, which is of paramount importance for deploying and developing artificial intelligence. We strongly believe that we need to give more access to individuals, to their, more control to individuals, to their personal data. At the same time, we acknowledge the fact that there are increasingly situations where this is not possible. So giving more user control should not translate to shifting the burden to individuals. I want to be clear. Consent has been a very powerful tool for individual participation over the past 40 years. However, now there are cases where consent is not viable, consent is not meaningful. Therefore, we need to think of other legal basis for data processing. Look at what Finland is doing for secondary use of data for healthcare purposes. It's processing is based on public interest. Look at opportunities to use legitimate interest as a ground for processing in very well identified situations, for instance, for security or safety purposes in connected cars. When I say the burden should not be on individuals, the burden should be on organizations, on responsible organizations that take accountability approaches to put in place technical organizational measures to minimize risk, to minimize harm to individuals. In some situations, we might also think of the possibility for automated decision-making to have some degree of human intervention based on the risks linked to that specific decision that is taken by an AI system. And I don't want to put on the same level all types of AI. Context is key to understand the situation, and so we don't want to have, for instance, human intervention in industrial control system. Probably we can defer on AI to that, but when it comes to job selection, when it comes to medical treatments, we want a human in the loop. You can read more about these things in the white paper that I also brought in the room, and it's here. There are a few copies over there. You can read more about this also in the draft legislation we published online for the US, when we try to give innovative and ethical use of data, and we try not to put too much burden on individuals when it comes to control over their data. I want to quickly pass to the second point of my presentation, which is how to enhance access to data via technology. And these technologies, privacy-preserving machine learning, are a very, very promising area of research at the moment, because they can be used as a set of techniques. Their performance still have some room for improvement, their usability as well, but it's extremely promising what they can do. We can actually perform AI without necessarily having too much access to personal data. So when it comes to federated learning, you can pull data without sharing it. You can perform machine learning when data is still encrypted when it comes to homomorphic encryption. And we can add some noise, we can add some mathematical protection of individuals when it comes to differential privacy. For this presentation, I thought of a use case that is covered by the label up there, but it's financial services. Imagine a bank that wants to develop a fraud detection model. So they go to an AI company and they ask for this model to be developed. The bank needs, the AI company needs some data, and retailers have some data that may want to share without necessarily sharing too much information about their customers. And so we see, for instance, the use of federated learning to improve the model. The model can go back to the AI company, and we use data without retailers sharing the data with AI company. On top of it, if we want, we can add some noise locally for each retailer in order to avoid that the AI model learns about customers of those specific retailers. Once the model is ready, the bank, which is somewhere there on the screen, asks the AI company to verify a transaction. The data is shared encrypted. The result goes back to the bank encrypted, and the bank is the only player in the process that has a key to decrypt the result. So you see, all these techniques together would offer a phenomenal way to actually use machine learning, use AI, minimizing the number of players that are actually accessing to the personal information of individuals. My third point is privacy is part of trustworthiness, and ethics can be built on privacy practices. Due to the complexity of the current tech landscape, we cannot look just at privacy as a silos. We need more integrated approaches, and so when it comes to trustworthiness, we need to look at privacy, security, safety. We need to look at resilience. We need to look at ethics. All these aspects together need to be part of the pictures. The approaches should be, tech policy approaches should be also multidisciplinary. And so we can build on the phenomenal experience we had with privacy when we refer, for instance, to privacy assessment, impact assessment, privacy by design. But we need more professional skills and more skill sets to be able to assess what are really the impacts to individuals. The last point here is we need risk-based approaches. And not all the use cases require the same level of oversight, and we probably need still to map all the situations before going into regulating these aspects. So here is a very brief summary of what I just said, and I would be delighted to engage further with all of you today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. I think there was a clear message coming through around the concept of ownership of data and the level of understanding from an individual as to what companies do with the data. Simon, if I can just bring you in at this point. We've had GDPR for 18 months now. Who's doing it well? Well, which sectors, or what's the good looking like out there, in your opinion?
So the good people are the ones who've had the energy to move on.
Yeah.
So, and most of you here have heard this one way or another, but I've been at the ICO for just over a year now. Before that, I was running a consultancy that worked with lots of big corporates on their GDPR program. So I saw lots of firms who, as it got towards the big deadline, just became very compliance focused, very tick box focused, and just fell over the line. Minimum defensible positions, because that's what was needed to manage the regulatory and compliance risk that they had. And I wouldn't blame anybody for that. But now, a year and a half in, however long it is, it's which ones managed to pick themselves up. Probably not day one after GDPR. I think everybody kind of needed a bit of time, but said, okay, well, how do we get back to actually focusing on doing the right thing, on what is good practice around transparency, ethics, broader concepts, rather than just staying focused on tick box compliance?
Do you think that's driven by brand rather than law?
I think it's a cross-team brand and sector as well. So one of the areas I think generates risk both for privacy and for ethics in general is that in the old days we had certain industries that knew what to do with certain types of data. So if you're a retail bank, you don't need to go and inform everybody. You do need to, or for accountability reasons, but most people in your organisation get the fact that retail banking data is important, and keeping that data secure and confidential is important. And the same if you are in a healthcare company with trial data or patient data, etc., etc. The challenge now is, as is much commented upon, every organisation is a data company, and lots of sectors that have never had to handle data before are suddenly handling data, and before they were just making big bits of machinery or selling stuff to people. So there's issues there with the maturity of different sectors, and then within each sector there are absolutely some firms that do it better than others.
And Natasha, just on looking at the latest kind of solutions and tools, do you actually think that they're making a difference to individuals' lives? We've had GDPR. People have offered us a plethora of tools around privacy-enhancing technologies, but are they making a difference? Cookies being a perfect example.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was really great to hear Ricardo talking about privacy-enhancing technologies and some of the detail of how they work. But I'd like to give 3 kinds of examples that we've highlighted around the use of these technologies. And it's a nascent area, so none of these are kind of hugely widespread, so that has to be borne in mind. But 3 areas that we highlighted in our work. One was the use of a homomorphic encryption-based tool across the NHS by NHS Digital for linking health data across all different care providers. And this was done in such a way that you could link this data. It had a common way of de-identifying the data, so you could link it whilst keeping it de-identified, keeping it encrypted. And that massively increases the utility of National Health Service data, which is a real important asset that can really benefit people's lives. So that's a really nice example. Another example, which I think is great to be talking about in context of techUK, is an example of a tech organisation being able to pool data across all its members about performance across the sector, information that they will not want to share with each other. But active work that we've been engaging with the Financial Conduct Authority on is around using privacy-enhancing technologies in anti-money laundering. So this is an area of crime that's huge internationally, has a massive human cost, and they've been experimenting with lots of different groups, thinking about how you can use these technologies to better track money movement and tackle a massively under-detected crime that has significant human costs. So I think it's happening. I think there's certainly areas. I think that it's not so much at the moment at the level of individual use. We have thought about the role of personal data stores and people being able to have control of their data personally, but I think we've seen a little bit more around these kind of tools that are used by organisations for enabling better data use.
Ivana, you've advised countless companies on GDPR compliance. How effective do you think it is today, and how do we improve the standards around data governance?
Yes, it's a very good
question.
question.
What's your wish list for Christmas?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The thing is, I agree with Simon. GDPR is work in progress, isn't it? It's new. A lot of this will have to be tested. There are clear, open questions that we have at the moment, obviously. So, for example, if you say, looking at AI, if you say, so what does it mean, human intervention? What is the degree of human intervention? If you have, for example, 5 different solutions coming from automated means, and you've got a human deciding one of those 5, does that qualify as human intervention or not? And that's one query. Explainability and all the complexity around it, which is, the work that you've done on that is fantastic, but a lot of it will have to be tested, will have to be seen. Will have also to be seen how citizens and consumers respond to it, because explainability in a context of healthcare is very different from explainability in the context of financial decisions. So a lot of this will have to be seen, will have to be tested, will have to be looked at, and that's the other. There are also, I think, a number of elements where I have a little bit of concern, where we need a little bit more clarity, and I don't mean clarity from a purely regulatory perspective or GDPR perspective. So issues like, for example, transparency. What does that mean in concrete? And are we running the risk that actually transparency is going to fail exactly the people who need it the most? What does it mean to understand how the workings of a particular system, how far do we go? The issue about control, for example, what does that really mean? What is this to be in control, and how real is that? So those are all conversations that we need to have. I want to close with one thing, which I think is, to me, my personal opinion, is really important, because we are a digital ethics summit. There is a problem of language, because I don't think we're speaking the same language. For example, take the issue of discrimination. In the GDPR, there is the word discrimination, obviously, in privacy, from a privacy perspective. But if I talk about discrimination, we all talk about discrimination in a different way. A machine learning developer will talk about outcomes and outputs. Somebody from a legal background than me will talk about what is the reason why this discrimination is happening. We all have a different approach to it. And the problem, I think, the challenge, I think, that we have in privacy is to try and gain that common understanding of vocabulary, of words. So what does fairness mean? What does discrimination mean? And how can we develop a common vocabulary so that we can address these issues from a similar standpoint, rather than from a privacy legal standpoint, discrimination, human rights and consumer legislation, competition law? How can we harmonize on this? And I do think this is the challenge that we have in privacy.
Thank you. We've had the uproar of the facial recognition software use court decision, and now it's being appealed. And there was a call then that actually the privacy laws just aren't fit for purpose. Jenny, what's your view? Do you think GDPR plus is the answer? And that we need something more to... I'm kind of just thinking, oh no, not another law to try and roll out, but to build public trust and confidence. Is that the answer? Is it something else?
So I think that regulation can take us a certain amount of the way, but I also think it's about organisations acting responsibly and taking responsibility for what they do. I was reflecting on the question that you asked Simon about what are the good organisations doing. In my experience, the good organisations have not only done the kind of tick tick box exercise that they need to do, but they're then going out and actively engaging with their customers, their clients, the people whose lives they're affecting, to understand what their feelings are about the way in which the kinds of control they have over data, the kinds of, what their terms and conditions look like that they're saying yes to all the time, what they want to be bothered with, what controls they want to have, rather than whether they're going to be overburdened with them. And it's that engagement that I think the organisations need to step up and just do. I think that the expectations of people have radically changed, in part because GDPR has come in part because all of the scandals that we see every day in the newspapers, that has just raised awareness of the way in which data is being used within organisations. And that makes people inherently distrustful, because they don't, the headlines tend to be the worrying things, let's say. And that means that we have to be, I think organisations have to be much more proactive in actually engaging with people through a number of mechanisms, and it's that is going to make a difference to their if they actually listen to their practice, rather than just regulation over the top.
Martin, do you think that more regulation is the answer, or do you think it's a co-regulatory approach? We've got the data issues, we've got the online harms, we have the deep fakes. The emerging tech is causing all kinds of uncertainty with individuals, but can the gaps be answered by more regulation, do you think?
I think they can, if the regulation isn't piecemeal but takes a holistic perspective. When I think about these issues, increasingly I think of an iceberg. And I think that what we're all doing is we're looking at the part of the iceberg that is above the water. And we're thinking about it in terms that we understand, or we think we understand. It's an issue about privacy, it's an issue about bias, it's an issue about discrimination. I think they're all correct, and they blind us to the overall changes in our societies, for good and for bad, that the pervasiveness of data is having. Ivana mentioned a really helpful, important point earlier around representational harm. There's a fantastic, and this may be what you were referring to, there's a fantastic piece of research a few months ago by Kate Crawford at the AI Now Institute, looking at ImageNet, which is one of the big repositories of images that train machine learning algorithms, millions of different pictures, images, and they did this amazing piece of work. I really encourage you to look at it, called Excavating AI, where they looked at how the images were labeled. And the images are labeled incredibly derogatory, biased, discriminatory ways, in all sorts of ways imaginable, which I won't go into for obvious reasons. And I think what we're missing is the implication of that. And I think in Kate's work, the notion of aggregate representational harm was a really powerful one. And I think that we need to delve into and understand the aggregate harm, emphasizing both pieces in that sentence, that data is having on our societies, and the aggregate good. And that's what we need to really grapple with. And I think GDPR is a weird thing. It's both vital, and I think it's the ghost of data protection past. It's focused on the way we were thinking about it a few decades ago. And I'll finish just with one, and this may seem like an obvious example, but I think examples are helpful. GDPR can't deal with an issue that arises as a result of lack of data, right? So if you're disabled and you're using Google Maps to figure out how you can get from A to B, not via cab or elsewhere, Google Maps doesn't have the data in most cities when it comes to avenues, routes that are friendly to people who have different disabilities. And that issue, I think, is really interesting, because the issue there is a lack of data, but at the same time, the problem we're facing is a pervasiveness and an over-collection of data. I think we really have to engage with that very, very deeply. And so I can't resist giving another example, because examples are helpful. On optimization, take Waze, right? Traffic navigation software that many of you will use. Waze is optimized to get you most efficiently from A to B. Waze doesn't care at all whether A to B involves sending 1,000 cars through quiet residential streets where kids were playing in the street previously. Because the optimization focuses on users of the system, Waze users. It focuses on the majority of the users, and it focuses on data that is collected and that exists. I think that's a really devilish problem, because the computer science answer to that problem is say, ooh, collect the data on the residents of the streets and then we'll know what their problem is. No, we don't want the street residents to have to give away their data so that Waze can sort of account for them in its algorithm. So I think that's what I mean with that other part of the iceberg, which is the overall impact and the implications of data on our societies. And I think that sorry, that's a really long answer to your question. If we can take a step back, as our sort of forebears did for decades ago, and look at that overall problem, then I think, yes, regulation can help. And the last thing in 10 seconds I'll say is we're taking a really Western and very OECD take at this whole issue. And when we're talking about individualization, I think if you push GDPR, you push it to the limit, and you make it, it accounts for output data and it accounts for inferences, you're really only solving it for a portion of the planet. You're not solving it for other regions aside from the OECD countries. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Thank you. The database that you referred to, I was in Shanghai delivering a keynote in September, and I put my image taken from the professional photographer there, and it put me as an air stewardess, which, come what may. And the Chinese guy behind me, I was down on a cog, so it's on my Twitter feed. So yeah, there's nothing against air stewardesses, but that wasn't the look or the presentation that I was giving. Ricardo, can technology save us? So we think more regulation may not just be the answer. Can technology save us? Will more regulation stifle innovation and tech, do you think, in the space?
Well, great question. Technology is no silver bullet. So technology needs to work in combination with regulatory and legislative frameworks that are flexible enough to be able not to stifle technology, and so be able to adapt to the upcoming technologies. We don't need new laws, new privacy laws. GDPR already lays down lots of principles, lots of very important principles. We need to understand how to operationalize them. And so some interesting work can be done at standardization level when it comes to artificial intelligence, for instance, and ISO is doing great work on ontology, is doing great work on trustworthiness in AI. The National Institute for Science and Technology in the US has started a very interesting work on trustworthiness that we should look at. I think that the ICO is doing a great job in finding new regulatory paths to address technology and understand better which are the rules that are, for instance, enshrined in the GDPR. So the sandboxes exercise is a good one. But in general, all the guidance that is coming from regulators at the moment is of utmost importance. The GDPR has the merit of creating more predictability and creating harmonization across member states. So I think it's, as Simon said, too young, and it's certainly too early to try to think of additional layers of legislation. One important challenge that was mentioned by others and that I referred to in my presentation is how we manage to compose risks, because it's not just privacy risks, it's safety, it's security, ethics. There are so many risks and so many human rights at stake that we need to find ways. And at the moment, there's not a method for risk composition. Ivana mentioned the problem of language. There is also a problem of matrix. We cannot measure risks in the same way. And so all this is work that industry, academia, public sector have to do together, and needs to be addressed going forward.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that technology is always innovation. I think sometimes we have technology for technology's sake. I was planning on opening up for any questions from the audience. The technology isn't particularly working well in this instance, so we'll just go with the old school approach.
Thank you. I was wondering, sorry, it's Jessie Leonard from Visa. I was wondering what balance the panel might like to see in terms of processing of data with, let's say, legitimate interest behind it, or the example that Ricardo gave around sort of for social good, versus individual consumer mechanisms which would allow, for example, consent. So to what extent is the privacy tech market in the consumer space important to actually make it possible for consumers through easy processes to consent when they want to or not, versus how much should we be looking at those bigger, higher level, more aggregated type of mechanisms?
Simon, do you want to, if we can find a mic?
Oh, they're going this way. These are the microphone holders over
down
here.
The side.
Just, great question, and I think I would reach to our experience within the ad tech market to sound a few warning shots around legitimate interest and consent here, and without coming with it, well, I'm going to admire the problem rather than go one way or the other. So we're doing a lot of work, as many people know here, on advertising technology and how that market works. Large parts of that market rely on legitimate interests. And at this point, I always kind of paraphrase The Princess Bride. Legitimate interests, you keep on using that phrase, I do not think it means what you think it means. And yeah, some of the audience get that, and some of the audience like, never, yeah. It can be easily abused, and what we've found in that market, as we looked at different assessments of how it's being applied, is very often that's being interpreted as, well, we've got a bit of an interest in this, it's kind of useful to us, maybe commercially useful, therefore it's okay. When under GDPR, and under the directive, it wasn't very heavily defined, under the old directive, under GDPR it is much better defined as a higher threshold. And so if we go down the legitimate interest route, then often we see people abusing that, frankly. The flip side with consent is we are also keen not to support, engender a rush to consent. I think both Natasha and Martin alluded to this in different ways. We've got to recognise that there are often imbalances of power, and there's questions of design around consent. And it's, if you just say, well, we've given some notice, we've collected some consent, therefore everything is okay, we're not looking at the dark patterns that are exercised to influence people to give consent, and we're not looking at the situations they are being put into, which make them feel they're obliged to obtain consent. So basically, right now, I've just basically criticised two bases of processing. But in both cases, I think that we've got to step back and say, okay, well, what is really fair? What is proportionate? How do you get transparency? How do you get more of a balance of power in there before you go in there? So it will depend on context a lot.
Does anyone else want to chip in?
And I mentioned legitimate consent as one of the places where I think that there needs to be that extra level of detail about how to get legitimacy and what counts as legitimacy, and a bit more activity from a regulator's point of view around saying, well, prove that that's legitimate. Prove that your clients and your consumers are okay with the kind of processing that you're doing. And having that bar, as you say, much higher than we currently think of it, and actually regulated around, I think would be very useful to help us get to that balance, because the individuals are giving consent without really giving informed consent at the moment. So how we get to that legitimacy, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah, and so to build on that, because I think that's something key for the ICO to do, and again, this is part of the GDPR being young. So within the ad tech work, as we've spoken to ad tech players who said, well, we use LI, we say, well, we'll see your legitimate impact assessment, let's have a look at it, and most of them have been really poor. And I think it's going to be a pattern you see with the ICO and other privacy regulators is, part basic accountability now is if you're using legitimate interest, you'll have a legitimate interest assessment. Also, if you're high-risk processing, you'll have a DPIA. And so it's going to be, within the first 2 minutes of any kind of conversation where we think there's an issue, we're great, well, just show us the paperwork. And so that's we've got to get that into our business as usual discussion, which we are doing, but it's going to take time to percolate out.
Earlier in my presentation, I said well-identified cases for legitimate interest, because legitimate interest should not be any blanket authorization for data processing, but rather should encourage companies to put in place all these accountability measures that Simon just mentioned.
Next question.
Thank you very much. Julia Manning from UCL Interaction Centre. I feel that I've got a really basic question that I'm not sure why I don't have the answer to already, and that is around encryption. I'm looking at using wearables in a study, and I want to be able to assure my participants that their data is going to be encrypted as a basic level of safety and privacy assurance. And I am really struggling to find really any interest in industry in using encryption in these public devices, which people are giving their consent to, and we've already heard a bit about consent, but consent is so opaque and so difficult, so people really don't know what they're consenting to. But if they could be assured around encryption, surely that would be a step forward. But industry doesn't seem to be interested, apart from Apple, in doing so. Why do you think that is?
Anyone want to kick off with that? Yeah.
I'll start if nobody's got the microphone in my hand.
That's how we want it, right? The regulator of the microphone.
So in short, I think there's been a big issue within IoT and IoT plus security for a while, which is manifesting itself in wearables, and we produced some stuff on this, some commentary rather than anything big, a little while ago about how this affects wearables in general. So yeah, we're concerned about it. I think again it comes back actually to some of the points made this morning around, well, how do we actually embed some of this thinking into the engineering community, into the people who aren't in this room, and get them thinking about these points, because they are not incentivized to actually consider that as they're building these devices. And yes, it affects wearables. I think it affects a whole range of IoT. If I'm pessimistic about it, it's going to carry on being that way until we have a series of scandals in the way we had, say, with connected toys, and you had hackers shouting at babies in cots, that kind of thing. Then suddenly it will come through, because somebody will realise that their heart rate's being monitored by the lamppost or some such. And until then, I'm a little bit pessimistic that we're going to get that message cutting through.
Yeah, just briefly on this, I don't have an answer to that question, but I think one of the things that it's really important to think about when it comes to connected devices, and this came up with a case study that we used in our work on smart meters, is how you can design a system so that you aren't necessarily having to share data with the central system anyway, so you can do much more kind of computation and analysis on the device itself, and thinking about how we actually have a more kind of sort of strategic think about the design of these systems so that the data processing happens in a much more local way and is therefore safer as a result of that.
But that should be happening by privacy by design anyway, shouldn't it? Really, is this a failure in the law, or is this just a failure of enforcement, or any views?
No, I was going to say, in relation to this, I mean, there are two elements. I mean, so obviously, the privacy and security by design in the IoT is a massive thing, because that's where you build the security and the safety of them. And there are good standards out there that people can follow. I mean, there is some work done, for example, at European level. I mean, it's been... there is also something else that I was thinking about when you were always speaking, which is around... I mean, I've come to think that probably we need some privacy and data protection storytellers, because there is a problem here that when you start using a wearable, or when you start using, when you get a connected device or a toy, whatever it is, the way that we ask people and we explain to consumers what's going to happen to their information, and we enter in a dialogue with them, is so poor most of the times, because not enough effort is going in disciplines like legal design or innovative ways to talk to consumers and customers. So there is both elements. So the privacy by design is crucial, especially by negotiation and by deliberation. When you actually talk to people, say, what would it make you comfortable? What would be an engagement? That is a key principle of GDPR, in terms of engage with people then going to use these wearables, in terms of where is the threshold and where they feel comfortable. But also, I mean, I sometimes I just think why aren't we investing enough in telling a story about data journeys, in telling a story about how to say yes or no to something in a way which works for people? Because we don't. We just present things in a way which is just people are not going to read and not going to go through it because it's just too much.
Martin, do you have a view?
Yeah, just very briefly, reflecting on your question, which I think was also like, why isn't it the case? I think one of the reasons is the fact that now data protection authorities are speaking to consumer protection authorities and competition authorities, and they're less siloed, is really recent. And that's only happened in the past 3 or 4 years. We received the first grant application for such a program a couple of years ago, and it was unheard of beyond that. The second reason, I think, is that consumer protection organizations have been, and this is not a criticism of them, but I think they've been slow on the uptake when it comes to advocacy and work on those topics. That's changing. Consumer Report in the United States now have a digital standard, and they've been pushing and doing the same type of analysis of products as they've been doing in other industries, and they've been looking at privacy, but that's new. Again, we're talking about 2 or 3 years. That's starting in Europe, but we're still playing catch up. So I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done, and it's about, again, sort of not seeing this as a sort of siloed data protection and privacy. So I think, and privacy question, I think it's promising. But the reason why it's not, as you say, it's not a basic question, it hasn't happened, is because we're just sort of in that growth phase.
Yeah, and actually we should say it's a bloody good question, by the way. It's not in any way a basic question. But to build on Martin's point, I think it's entirely fair to say that the ICO did a fantastic job in the build-up to GDPR because it took a huge amount of effort for complete rewrite of the rulebook to actually kind of get enough basic guidance out there on what the GDPR was. And in my old job, I remember before on the big tech firms, did a massive review of all the guidance that's coming out across Europe, translated it all, they wanted to know which was the best guidance, and the ICO came out tops. And that was at a time when there was a lot of turnover, there was still austerity. I wasn't there, but it was a Herculean effort by the people who were there. That all said, it does mean that it wasn't just that data controllers that fell over the line GDPR time. The ICO also just got past the line, having done the basic guidance on all those different areas. And so in the time I've been at the ICO, and I just sheer luck when I joined, you've got an ICO which now is looking outwards a lot more. So to Martin's point, we are absolutely doing a lot more work with other regulators right now. So for instance, right now the CMA is producing its market study on digital platforms. We work very closely with them on that. Privacy and competition is a very big thing right now. But also to your point around IoT, that's something which, like I say, we put out some basic IoT guidance a little while ago that commented on some of these issues. But we do not have enough technologists internally right now to cover all the risks that are coming up. We're looking to bring in more technologists, to use more external sources of expertise, talk to other regulators and how we build capacity collectively. But this is all work in progress. So I think in terms of, well, what can regulators do on these emerging issues, that's something we're having to work with quite actively right now. I wouldn't say the ICO has all the answers, but we know we've got to do more in this area.
So I'm told we just have time for one final question, and I'm not going to be able to select which. Sorry.
Thank you. Just a little question, shall we say, to challenge the panel at the end of this session. We can have all the rules and regulations we like, but some organisations will blatantly go ahead and misuse our data, ignoring their responsibilities around data ethics. A classic example is Cambridge Analytica. And for the average citizen, they seem to have got away with it. Regulation is toothless. So how can we address this challenge and regain the trust and also assure that ethics is baked in?
Who wants to kick off with it?
I'll kick off, and I disagree strongly that the regulation is toothless. I think that in terms of what happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, that is an example of where that they didn't get away with it. There are plenty of other firms that do get away with stuff, and I think there's plenty of other issues around that. And there's, in terms of how regulators, when they enforce, how they enforce, it's tricky. I don't think that's a great example, and we haven't got time to go into all the bits and pieces of quite what happened in both those cases, or both those organisations in those cases. I think that the tools that we now have under the GDPR, for GDPR itself, accepting the limitations which have been explored, and I agree with the majority of what's been said around where the edges of GDPR are right now in relation to ethics. I think we at the ICO feel that we've got enough tools in that toolbox. Yes, there are big fines, and we have produced notices to levy some large fines. And we have a whole range of other powers which we're working at how we exercise in different situations. And we're still exploring that. So facial recognition comes up every 5 minutes in the conversation today, as it should do. Once the South Wales case had gone through the courts pre-appeal, we produced our opinion on FRT. That was the first formal use of the opinion, and it was very detailed and had a lot of material in it. So we're kind of okay that we're still exploring how we use those powers, but they're useful. I do think there are bigger questions around privacy and competition, and I do think there are bigger questions around with the largest platforms. What kind of action gets their attention? Facebook get fined $5 billion, which is a huge amount of money. Even to Facebook's a big amount of money, but their share price went up. Mark Zuckerberg was richer at the end of that day than he was at the start of the day. And so what other mechanisms make sense? But I would push back strongly on the idea that the current framework is toothless. I think pre-GDPR, I think it was an entirely valid thing to discuss. I think we should give GDPR a few more years before we make that conclusion this time around.
I would agree with you. I mean, I also think that it's naive to think probably that privacy will be, and privacy legislation will be the only thing that can be leveraged, because, for example, we talked about competition law, that we're hearing a lot of legislators and politicians across the world, using and talking about this. But also consumer law, I think, will increasingly becoming crucial with this regard. I also would add something which is around redress, and is around the role that citizens, and not just individual citizens, I also think about groups of people. So I mentioned representational harm, which is the fact that, how can the current system, think about the ad tech sector, continue to perpetuate discrimination. Yeah. So, for example, if you've got ads being served, they pay less being served to women, that is perpetuates inequality, and from an ethical standpoint, this is, I think, crucial thing to tackle. So my key question with this regards would be, yes, of course we can have all the regulators, yes, we can have all this sort of privacy legislation, but the key thing here is, what is redress to individuals and groups that have been harmed? Do we need a new body to be able to assess whether individual harm has taken place? So, for example, if I'm a victim of automated decision, I take this up and I say this has been unfair. Discrimination law is not sufficient because it doesn't fall under the protected characteristic, and I'm saying, well, I've been discriminated here. What if a group of people, they want to take action because they say, we are victims of representation discrimination? So the thing is, do we need to introduce some form of redress to supplement, the fact that regulators and privacy legislation in itself will not be sufficient because of the nature of the digital landscape we're living in?
Martin, my take on it is that's great, providing people are aware that they're being discriminated against, and you're not aware, so it's only when you find out.
Yeah, I completely agree. The point I wanted to make on Cambridge Analytica is, I think I'm really grateful to Cambridge Analytica for being the cardboard cutout villains that they are, and that I think they did us in some ways incredible service. From my perspective, I've never seen as much energy and work going into data governance as I have since March 2018. The other time was after the summer of 2013 and the Snowden revelations. I think the field has changed as a result. I think there's a much greater awareness that we need to work together on the sort of 4 pillars of online content regulation, data privacy, data governance, competition, and civic and digital literacy. Prior to March 2018, I didn't meet anyone who was talking about competition, data privacy, and online content regulation in the same breath. And now it's basically every single presidential candidate on the Democratic side in the United States. So thank you. And likewise, a year afterwards, Facebook being sued in the United States for discrimination around housing ads, I'm not sure that would have happened without Cambridge Analytica. So I think that I appreciate that it can feel frustrating, but the field really has changed, and it hasn't even been 2 years. I really think it's momentum there.
I think we're out of time. Or we've got to.
Well, just last wrap-ups from maybe the people who have.
Yeah. Can I just do a quick canvas? I'm doing this whenever I'm chairing a panel. Who agrees with the political advertising that's permitted by Facebook that's being enabled at the moment? Does anyone, show of hands, who agrees? Who's got a Facebook account? You know, we yet again show that we have the power to talk with our feet, but we're aware of what's going on, but it remains the main tool for communication for many people, and that's what, strong market positions allow. Anyway, thank you all from a panelist. Does anyone want some closing thoughts? Natasha, would you like to start?
I think what was prompted in my mind by the last question, the last bit of discussion, is this question of trust in organisations and their behaviours and how that can be enabled, but also, as you were just saying, trust in the information that we're seeing. And I think this question around how we kind of show the provenance of information, how we know when we've got good evidence, and how that is all affected by the online information environment is something that's really important. It's certainly something we're thinking about both from a social and a technical point of view. So I think it's really important that we have these broad questions around trust in not just organisations but the data that they give us.
Thank you. Martin?
I'd just say, I think these are great discussions. Too many of these conversations, weirdly actually, take place in a country, whether it's the UK, the United States, France, or others, and we don't have enough fora where we talk between ourselves and we learn from each other. I spend a lot of time in France, Germany, other countries, and the conversations are similar but different, and we need to be working together, and we don't have those platforms at this point.
I was just going to pick up on pieces around both the role of regulators and also those of third parties to be able to act on what kinds of misuses there are. One of the things that we need in order to make regulation more efficient, so for the work of the regulators more efficient and the work of third parties more effective, is more transparency about what is going on, about the use of algorithms, about the outcomes of algorithms, just about the way in which data is used, and preferably transparency about that in a machine-readable form, which means that you can automate over it. So that's my kind of final push. How do we do monitoring of the way in which data is being used, the kinds of outcomes that algorithms are giving us within companies that enable us to understand it in an automated way that lower the cost to regulators and third parties to provide that accountability we need?
I think the final point I would want to make is one about timing, because we're almost having two different conversations here. One is, if we had infinite time and resources, what would the best legal framework look like for this exciting, emerging, very broad area around ethics? And we need to have that conversation. Luckily, we're human beings, we can do more than one thing at once. But then we also have the fact that right now, as we speak, bad things are happening, and we have to use the tools we have available to us. And that's the thing where the GDPR is often the best game in town, not because it's superior to anything, but just because it's here, and there's mechanisms we can use. So there's a question, I think we need to have both these conversations. What does good look like in the future? How do we evolve where we get to when we have the opportunities to evolve it? But at the same time, in the real world right now, how do we use the tools we have available to us, of which GDPR is a rich chunk of the tool set, to address the harms that are happening? And where sometimes we might have to kind of push parts of the GDPR and say, well, how far does fairness go? How far does transparency go? And we just need to do both those things at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I just to follow up on that, I think is important, and that's why I would just stress the point that because we are a digital ethics summit, we always talk about how to discuss these issues, we need a multidisciplinary approach. And it's true. But I think we need to go a little bit further than that. I think we need real interdisciplinarity in this. And when we talk about privacy, when we talk about anti-discrimination, I really think it's important that we leverage all the tools that we've got. Because, as you say, there are bad things happening there, but we've got tools available. We've got consumer legislation. We've got anti-discrimination law. We have human rights legislation. We have competition law. We've got to be able to push and use all of them, and also understand where the limits are in each single one of those, and say, what is that is missing in the algorithm-driven society we live in? What's missing in here? So what's missing in privacy? What's missing in and be able to really to focus and tackle what we need to update and what we need to change in the current legislation. I'm upset.
Thank you. So, might have turned it off. Okay. Final thought. Probably. I hope we don't need another Cambridge Analytica to step up our conversation and our approaches to privacy and protection of individuals in general. I think we need to step up our conversation when it comes to accountability. It's not just accountability for an individual company, like Intel, for instance. We need to require accountability to the entire ecosystem. And when I say this, I refer to the possibility for companies to refuse to do business with other companies that when they don't have high confidence that these companies are not behaving in the interest of users, protecting users. We recently updated our human rights policy, and we have put a very high threshold for our customers to work with us. If we suspect that our technology is used for violations of human rights, of civil liberties, we do not want to do business with those companies, and we have, on the contrary, very low threshold to interrupt and dismiss this commercial relationship. So something to think about as accountability of the entire ecosystem, of the entire industry environment, and not just individual virtuous companies.
So that brings the session to a close. Can I just take a moment to thank my panelists? I'm #winning because we haven't got people screaming at me that we've run over.